So thank you for joining us today for this internal review training. This training is really to provide you with tips about how to conduct a self-assessment of your student files. So what we're going to do is kind of go through what we would be looking for as reviewers if we did the reviews. It's important component is to have your eligibility tools and resources document and your IEP TA guide as you go through this process to make sure you are documenting things correctly and have some examples of what that should look like. This training really does for administrators to, this training does not discuss how to download the IR form and how you can utilize it within your district. There was, this is October, special education director's call. We did talk about how an administrator could use this document, and so we'll get that information also posted on the same website as the internal review. But if you have questions on how to use it as administrators, please let Melissa Floor know at the Department of Education, which is me, and we can walk through that. Again, this internal review process is really to help ensure that your districts are following policies, practice, and procedures to implement the compliance needs of special education. So using this as an opportunity to grow professionally and handle any issues that might be occurring in that process. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat to everyone, or you can just select Melissa Floor and she will be answering those as we go along. Also, at the end of the eligibility section and at the end of the IEP section, we'll open it up for you to ask questions that way. Again, if you have additional people that are attending and would like the CH hours for continuing teacher certification, please let me know. Sometimes districts will send me after the recording to an email to who attended also. So if you have any other questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Amy and Lori.
Okay. Doesn't sound like there's any questions right now, and we'll go ahead and get started. We'll do some introductions first. I'm Lori Waylander, and I work for Black Hills Special Service Cooperative, and I have been working in special education for a lot of years in the state of South Dakota, and glad to be here today to help you with this internal review process. Amy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, welcome everyone. My name is Amy Beasley. I am also with Black Hills Special Services. Again, I haven't been in special ed as many years as Lori, but you know, we'll catch up eventually, right? So thanks for joining us. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and send Melissa a chat and she can address it that way.
Okay, so we're gonna start in here with the South Dakota Accountability and the internal review process. The first thing we're gonna look at is why we would do an internal review. Why is this something that the state is working on, and why has it been created for districts? So, South Dakota Department of Education Special Education Program Accountability Process. This is part of it. So, the special education federal compliance says that every 5 years districts have a federal type of review. In addition, districts can also be reviewed at different times throughout that 5 years if the district had a complaint or a due process in the past year, the district did not meet state targets on the state performance plan, and they might also look at other areas like extraordinary cost fund audit or significant disproportionality. So the review team analyzes the district's comprehensive plan, the child count, and visits schools for special education file reviews. And the reviewers use South Dakota DCR, the Digital Compliance Review, which is an electronic form, which is very similar to what we're going to be looking at today. So the next other thing is in the accountability process is RDA, or results-driven accountability. Through RDA, identification is made with a risk rubric based on indicators. The indicators are from your Smarter Balanced proficiency rates, your dropout, preschool, least restricted environment outcomes, post-school outcomes, and disability percentages. So the districts are identified for different levels of support, level 1, level 2, or level 3. And depending on where you'd fall, you may have an RDA coach that's assigned to assist with a data retreat, a root cause analysis, creating an action plan for your district, any type of professional development that the district might feel is needed, and to help with this internal review process. So the internal review process is what we're going to go through today. This is an in-house process for districts to review individual student files at a district level to check for compliance. This is something you'll do within your district. Each teacher will have a file, and you'll be looking at those files to see if it's compliant. It mirrors the DCR form that the state reviewers use. It can be used for preparation for a compliance review. If you're on that 5-year cycle, this can be used to help identify any areas before that review happens. It can be used to develop professional development and to understand regulation alignment. If you see an issue through this internal review process, you may be able to determine you need some assistance in certain areas. And it is a requirement of RDA.
So now we're going to talk about the specifics of the internal review document themselves. So the SD digital compliance document is used when accountability reviews are conducted. So each district has access to the internal review. And again, like Lori said, it mirrors the DCR. Again, this allows you to do self-assessments at any point in time. It also allows your district to collect data and bring to light any potential concerns within the district IEP process. It's also important that districts are mindful of the required and expected content when answering the questions on the internal review form. So during today's training, we're going to go through that internal review and the expectations and the criteria that go with each area. When looking at the internal review document, it is there to gather data and not to be submitted to the state. If there's a concern with this being shared, staff are not required to complete the student demographic information. So this is your district's decision. So this is where you would, we're talking about the student name, the SIM number, date of birth. Any of that information, your district will determine how to input that data or how they want you to follow that process. So how you set up this tab is really entirely up to you. And the information typed into these cells will be auto-populated into the corresponding cells within the given file. So you'll see file 1 has all the same information. Reviewers, staff reviewed, student name, SIMs, date of birth, race, disability code, and type of IEP. When you input data into those cells, they will auto-populate just for file 1. The same information can be inputted for file 2, and that information will just go for file 2. In the internal review document itself, you will see a column called Findings and Notes. This section is a really useful tool. So you can type in any comments you have within that area that you either need more training in or more guidance in. You can also note something that you might be a finding or out of compliance to then decide what action should be taken. The comments that are put in the findings and notes will help the state determine the area or the areas of need across the state that might be, or what professional development or support might need to be provided to all districts. So now we're actually going to go into the internal review document itself. This is where you want to pull up that document and then also have your file ready if you do have one to maybe locate the items there. So I'm going to switch my screen to the document. So on this document, when I talked about the information being auto-populated, you'll see that we are in file 1 on the bottom here. And that information that is auto-populated will actually come up to the information right on top here. So again, you can match the student name, the SIMS number, the date of birth, disability code, race, and the type of review.
Amy,
Yep.
can you make that larger?
Yeah. I made it small because some of the comments, the box doesn't show up all the way on the screen. So if I have to make it smaller, I can do that too. All right, so record of access, you'll see when Lori and I talk about each of the comments or sections, you'll see these red arrows, and that's where the comments are to help with guidance. So the first section I'm going to talk about is the record of access. Do you know where the record of access is in your file, and can it be located? With the record of access, there's no specific form that the state requires, so the districts can have their own form. It's important, though, to make sure that the name of the party, the date access was given, and the purpose of which the party is authorized to access the file. That information is provided in the record of access form. So when completing your internal review, if the documentation is present, then you would mark yes. If the documentation is not present, then you would mark no. And just remember that a record of access is a compliance issue. Next, we're going to go to referral. So with the referral, there's a few sections or a few points to remember here. You first want to ask yourself, is it an initial evaluation or is it a re-evaluation? This section here is used to address a file that the most recent evaluation is an initial evaluation. So that means that if you answered this is a re-evaluation, then you would mark NA and then move on to the next section, which is the initial placement. If you answered that this is an initial evaluation, then you want to ensure that your referral form is located within the file and you know where to find it. If there is evidence of the referral information, you want to mark yes. But if there's information missing as far as the documented date and then the areas of referral, then you would mark no if those are not present. So there is no state mandate referral form. And so some districts may have their own referral form, so know that. Within the referral form, again, you want to fill out the date of the referral. So the date written request, which brings the student to attention of the school district administrator. And then a referral made by a parent may be submitted verbally, but it must be documented by the district administrator. So make sure you document that date. And then for the areas of referral, this is information that was used to determine if the evaluation proposed for the student is comprehensive. So addressing all of those needs and concerns. And then complete the form with documented areas, then you would also select yes. And when we talk about selecting yes, it's right in this first column here. So next we're going to move on to the initial placement. So with the initial placement, this section will reflect the team's process of reviewing data and evidence that will help them determine if the student will evaluate or determine the areas of concern to be evaluated. So existing data does not include those evaluations or observations that the team is proposing to conduct. Only those that have already been completed and are the reason for the concerns and subsequent referral. Okay, if you have that initial placement and you put the date in here, then you would mark yes. If you were missing any of that information, then you would mark no.
Okay, after the team gets the referral done, you're going to be looking at that evaluation process and what the team decides to do with the evaluation. So this section will look at all the documents related to the most recent evaluation. So if you're looking at a file that the most recent one was done over a year ago, that's what we're looking at. Whatever the most recent evaluation is, that's the one we're going to be looking at. You will be reviewing the prior written notice for consent, looking to make sure all the evaluations were done and did it meet all the eligibility? Did you have all the eligibility documents? Examples of a prior written notice consent, you can refer to the eligibility tool and resources document to help you fill that out. So when you find your prior written notice for consent, you're going to look to see when was it sent. Make sure you have a prior written notice consent form in your file, and then when was the prior written notice sent to the parent, and put that date right there. So once you have that, you move to the next area we'll be looking at. Make sure you have your consent form in your file. And did the parent give documented consent for an evaluation to be conducted? And then we're looking for that written consent to make sure the parent had agreed to this. If there is documentation of parent consent prior to the evaluation, the start date, you can mark yes, that yes, you had that parent consent. If the parent did not give consent prior to starting the evaluation process, and this is a reevaluation, you will need to have documentation that attempts were made to get parent consent. If you have this documentation, you can mark yes. So you have to make sure you have that parent consent before you start any evaluations. The next area we look at on that consent document is the parent input. We want to see parent input into all the different steps of the IEP process. So it's an essential piece of documentation needed on that prior written notice for consent to evaluate. There's a specific section for parent input on the prior written notice, but you might also be able to find this information included in other places on the prior written notice. If there is documentation of parent input and documentation of attempts to get parent input, you can mark yes. If there is no documentation of parent input or documentation of attempts to get parent input, you must mark no, because this is a compliance issue. This is something that has to be done whenever you're doing that prior written notice for consent. Then we're going to be looking at those timelines again. Every time you do an evaluation, you have to look at those timelines to make sure everything is done according to the regulations. So one area we look at is to see if you have had an extension of that 25-day timeline. Did you get to when it was extended to? Did you get the parent initial? Did you get permission to do that? If there was no extension needed at any time, you would mark NA. So if there was an extension and it's documented to include new evaluation completion date. So you have to make sure you write in there what your new date is to get all these evaluations done. Does the extension include parent signature initials or other documented agreement of the new date? Then you would mark yes. If there was an extension and there is no documentation agreement, then you have to mark no, because that's a compliance issue. If you don't have that parent agreement, then you cannot go outside of that 25-day timeline, or that 25 school day. Then we're continuing through that consent for prior notice. We're going to look at that A, B, C, and D. Required content has to be in all of those areas. And it needs to be individualized to the student and the IEP team decisions. There's lots of examples on how to really get the information you're looking for the team on this. And if you need that can, there's ways we can help you out to get that information on there. But they all have to be filled out, A, B, C, and D. So if any area is missing the required content and not individualized, that's what we're looking for, how it's individualized for that specific student, then you will need to mark no for this entire section. So let's look at A. So evaluation of why the district proposed or refused to take action. So why is the district doing an evaluation? Is there a description of why the team feels the need to evaluate or is proposed not to evaluate? So a good example is student is making steady progress over the past 2.5 years on IEP goals in the area of reading. However, skill-based assessments and classroom performance indicate the student is unable to keep up with the core curriculum and may require additional services. We feel we need to take a close look at the skills and content learned in order to analyze his needs. So it's very individualized, very specific for that student. A not so good example of this is student's 3-year reevaluation date is due. We're not looking for regulations about timelines or timeframes. We're looking for why the team thinks this individual student needs to do this evaluation or what was rejected. So if you're rejecting an evaluation, a good example would be the student has met all IEP goals and objectives for the past 2.5 years. He has also demonstrated proficiency on grade level standards through skill-based assessment. That shows exactly why you are not going to go do the evaluation. So an unacceptable one there. Is a student is no longer in need of special education services. Well, that doesn't really tell us why did you determine that? How did you determine that? What is happening that you believe that that student is no longer in need of services? The next area there is description of other options considered and why they were rejected. What did the team consider and what did the parents request? A good example of this is the IEP team considered assessment of the student in reading, math, and behavior. However, the interventions suggested by teacher assistance team and conducted by the teacher indicate that student is making progress in math. The behaviors are not impeding the student's learning. So it is a team decision based on very specific information for that student. So you must consider and reject something. You always have to do this. And as you work through the IEP or work through it, there's always usually something that was rejected. So a statement here, such as the IEP team did not have anything to reject in this time is unacceptable. There could be multiple things. So leaving this area blank would also be a compliance issue and you would have to mark no. The next section there, description of evidence used for the proposed and refused action. So what evidence did the team discuss to support the decision made to evaluate or not evaluate? Evidence used to make proposal or rejection could include your previous 3-year eval, your current academic performance, current IEP and progress reports, skill-based assessments, or district benchmarks. Those are all good examples of things you could use. Not acceptable would be the decisions were made as we were all in agreement. It doesn't tell us what you were in agreement of, or how did you come to this agreement. We are looking for that information. It has to be clear to the team on why you made this proposal or rejection. Not listing what was used to make the decision or listing what assessment the district will conduct in the future would be a compliance issue. We're looking for what you have done, you've brought into this to make this decision to move forward with this evaluation. And you would have to mark no, as it would be a compliance issue. And then D, description of other factors that are relevant to proposal or refusal. So have you listed other factors in that section? Could include issues related to medical, attendance issues, environmental factors. There's many things that you could list on here that are other factors. So an acceptable statement would be the student is 15 years old. He won't be 16 in 7 months. So the team decided to evaluate transition area later this year. So that's what you decided not to do transition right now, and you're going to do it later in the year. So that is a good example. If you've left it blank, then once again, it is a compliance issue. So are your statements clear and descriptive? That's what we're looking for here. When somebody picks this up, can they read it? Do they understand what the team based their decision on, why they did these things? Is it clear to the person reading this? If all requirements are complete, you would mark yes for this section. Any component not meeting these requirements or missing information results in a no for the entire section and is a compliance issue. Then we get into that timelines. And when you input this information above, and it will populate down here. So this will come up, a lot of these dates will come up for you. So you got to look up for that prior written notice, and you want to look at the dates that are on there, and you want to document when you sent it, the date the parent signed it, and on that prior written notice, you should document when the district received it. Sometimes it's different than when the parent actually signed it. So look for that date the district received it. Then you're gonna look at your school calendar and figure out your 25 school days. Once you figure out the 25 school days, it will populate with the 30 calendar days. And then you need to determine if you put an extension on for the 25 days. So locate your prior written notice consent. Look at those dates. These are your evaluation timelines. Did you meet the required timelines? If you are unable to locate or determine these dates, you will need to mark no in this section, as it is a compliance issue. So when you get that prior written notice, you want to make sure though that the parent has signed it and dated, that you as a district document when you received it. So when you go back and do this file review, or the state comes in and does a review, it's very clear on what happened with this individual student. So once you get that back and you have all that documented, then your timeline starts to do evaluations. So the next section that we look at from that prior written notice is the evaluations. So in here, you're going to list all the areas for evaluation that you listed on the prior written notice consent. And we're going to make sure that you have an evaluation report associated with every area for the evaluation. So you need your evaluation reports to complete all the areas tested, name of the test given for each area, a date the particular test was given. This may be a range of dates also, and name of the evaluator giving each test. So those are the 4 things that we're looking for. We look at that prior written notice. We list all the areas that you said you were going to test in. Then we're going to look at that eval report to make sure you gave that test, and we're going to write down the name of the test given in that area. After that, we're going to look at the date the test was given, and then the name of the evaluator. So when you're doing this internal review and you look at your eval reports and you can't determine those things, or it's confusing in your eval report, that's something as a district you might want to look at to create a way so you make sure you're documenting all these things. So then, were all the evaluations listed on the prior notice, were they given and contain all the required information? We would mark yes. Were any evaluations listed but not given? Then we're going to mark no. And were any additional evaluations given that were not on the prior notice consent? You'd also mark no. So we're going to compare that prior written notice consent with your evaluation report and make sure they all line up, that you're doing exactly what you said you were going to do. And then also on the prior written notice consent, you might bring forward existing evaluation information. Something might be pulled forward. This might be an outside eval or a previous eval that is still valid, things like that. So you're going to list those on your prior written notice consent, any existing evaluation data. So were there any already completed or existing evaluations that team pulled forward? So we're going to look on the prior written notice consent, see if there's anything in that section. You can locate the documents being pulled forward for the evaluation. Can we locate those when you're looking at your file and you said you were going to pull forward maybe the ability testing from before or an autism test from before? When we look at the file, is that all pulled forward into this new evaluation? So we're going to list the areas tested, the corresponding tests given, the test date, and the evaluator. Once again, make sure that's all clear on your eval report, everything that you pulled forward. If a doctor's diagnosis is pulled forward, you must locate the actual diagnosis. It must be in the file. A reference to the diagnosis is not adequate. You have to actually have that medical doctor's diagnosis in your file. So once we get this all looked over, we're going to see if all the information listed as existing data being pulled forward is on the prior written notice can be located in this new eval. If we can find everything you said you're going to pull forward, you can mark yes. If you cannot locate the information on the existing data being pulled forward, you would mark no because it's a compliance issue. If you say you're going to pull forward, it needs to be pulled forward into the eval. So it would be out of compliance if it's not there. And if nothing was pulled forward, not looking at anything previous, you would just mark NA for this section. Now the next area we look at for compliance, and you would look at in your file, is that skill-based assessment report. So in this one, once again, we're going to look for those skill-based reports, make sure that they're all there. So you're going to review the skill-based information within the report and document the skill-based area, test given, and evaluator. So once again, we're going to be looking in that report to see the skill-based, what area it is, what test was given for it, and who the evaluator is. So we're also looking for dates on those also to make sure they're in the time frame. So when you're looking at your individual file, you want to be able to find this information. Once again, if you find as a district that the way you're writing up your reports, you're not including that information, or you can't find it yourselves, might be an issue you want to look at how you can have a best practice for yourself to improve that. So once we list all that skill-based information there, we're going to look at that present levels page on the IEP. So then you're going to get your IEP out and you're going to look at that present levels on IEP, the most recent IEP, connected to this evaluation, and validate that each area listed has skill-based assessment completed. If all this has been completed, mark yes. If any information is missing or doesn't link back to the present levels on the IEP, you would mark no, as this is a compliance issue. So once we get through all that skill-based information, for all the different areas tested, all the related services you might have looked at, everything, We're going to make sure that we did everything within, all those evaluations were done within the time frame or the window. So dates in this section will auto-populate. So when you got when you receive the consent, once you fill in your dates of your testing, it will pull forward that earliest testing date, and it will also pull forward the latest testing date. So, and then it's going to come up with a date were you within the 25 school days. You don't have to manually insert these dates when you're going through and filling out this internal review. If all the evaluation dates were within the 25-day testing window, you can mark yes. If any of the evaluation dates were before or after the 25-day window, you would mark no, as this is a compliance issue. Please make sure you refer back to your school calendar, because if you had snow days or other days that the school was not in session, it could impact that 25-day date. It may indicate that you were out of compliance when in fact you were not. You may need to have a school calendar to determine if in fact any assessments were outside of the 25-day timeline. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this. So then we're going to just we'll document a few things here when you're going through your file review to make sure everything matches up. If all evaluations listed in the prior written notice and only those that were listed were administered, you'd mark yes. If an evaluation was listed but not given, you would mark no, as this is a compliance issue. You didn't do everything you said you were going to. The next section there, consent was acquired. We're going to see if the consent and the evaluations given match up. If all evaluations that were administered were on the prior written notice consent, then you would mark yes. If evaluations were given that were not on the prior written notice consent, then you are mark no, as this is a compliance issue. You can't do evaluations, extra evaluations without consent. So you have to make sure that this matches up. But if you gave something that you didn't have consent for, you would have to mark no. Then a variety of sources. When you're doing an evaluation, you want to bring a lot of different sources in to determine, to complete that evaluation. So if multiple sources were used, you would mark yes. Then that met requirement of the disability. Did you evaluate in all required areas? As you know, for whatever disability you're looking at for, there are certain evaluations that need to be done for eligibility requirements. So when reviewing the student's information, was the information comprehensive enough to determine student need and determine eligibility for special education? If so, mark yes. If there was something that you found that you didn't complete for a certain disability category or whatever, then you would have to mark no, that you did not meet all the required areas. Then we move into that 30 calendar days. And instead of school days, now this is calendar days, 30 calendar days. So when day 26 was on, whatever date that was from above, that will pull forward. And then you're going to find your eligibility determination. And you're going to find out what date you did that on. And you would put that date in here. So the question is, did the team determine eligibility within 30 calendar days following the 25 school day timeline? If these dates fall within the 30 calendar days, you would mark yes. If they fall outside of the 30 days, you would mark no. So the next section is student eligible for special education. We're looking at that eligibility document. Is there documentation to support and meet the eligibility of special education within the category the student was determined eligible? We're going to make sure that you included in your eligibility document the different areas you looked at and how, if you determine them eligible or not. If that's all in there, then we would mark yes. Now, if it's a 3-year eval, course, we have that requirement that it has to be done within that 3 years. So did the reevaluation occur within the 3-year time frame of the previous termination date, eligibility termination date? So eligibility, yes. So did we do that within the 3 years? Put in both the current eligibility termination date and the previous eligibility date to ensure the 3-year compliance. If current eligibility is within 3 years of the previous eligibility, mark yes. If it's not within the 3 years, mark no, as this is a compliance issue. You have to do that within the 3 years. If you are reviewing a file with an initial eligibility, you would mark NA. It's not applicable at this time. And then the last section is if you were looking to evaluate for dismissal of services, which you would mark yes or no, whatever you're doing there.
Okay, I am going to zoom out for this one. There is a lot when it comes to eligibility for specific learning disability. So specific learning disability, or SLD, is the only eligibility area that requires content. So if your student was not considered, you will mark NA, and then you can just move on to the next section. So that next section would be the meeting notice, and we'll show you where that's at. If the student is eligible for the category or if the team did consider SLD as an eligibility category, then you will need to complete these sections. There's 2 sections, and so one is for the initial and one is for reevaluation. On the left-hand side, you'll see that there's some plus signs that will take you to either the initial or to the reevaluation. And I'll show you, they're right over here. So they're kind of small, but this is where you would click those. So you want to make sure that you locate and verify that the team did address under the area, again, whether it's initial or reevaluation. So if the area or item was not addressed, then you must mark no for the entire section. So this will result in a compliance issue. If all areas were addressed within the eligibility and the evaluation is located, then you can mark yes. And we're going to go through each of those sections within the eligibility for specific learning disability. So under the first box, you're going to check the areas that were addressed for initial or reevaluation. So that, again, that first box here, you will address for both initial and reevaluation. Where you see the difference in the initial and the reevaluation is in the colors. Initial is green and the reevaluation is kind of a red color. Let me zoom in for this one. So for an initial, this is the first time that SLD is being considered. So if so, then you would complete this section of the document. So here you will need to verify that the areas were addressed on the eligibility document. And if they were not addressed, then you would have to mark no. If each of these areas were addressed, then you would mark yes. For the reevaluation, then you would address this section of it. And so again, you want to make sure each area was addressed. And if one or more than one was not addressed, then you would mark no. If all of them were addressed, you would mark yes. And then for SLD, again, this is the only eligibility category where signatures from each team member is required. So you would want to look at the eligibility document to make sure that each team member signed and indicated that they were in agreement for the eligibility or for non-eligibility. If there is a team member that is in disagreement, then written input should be presented and put in the file with that eligibility document. Again, if all required content is present, then you can mark yes. If signatures or any written reports upon non-agreement are missing, you would want to mark no, as that is a compliance issue. Okay, so that is the end of the eligibility portion. Are there any questions that we can address for this section? Okay, I don't see anything in the chat. Melissa, are we clear?
I don't have anything in the chat either.
Okay, great. So now we're going to move to meeting notice. So this is the section that if your student was not eligible for, or considered for SLD, that you would move to. So with the meeting notice, the purpose of this is that you want to really look to see were all the required team members present at the meeting or invited to the meeting. So this is for the most current IEP. Again, if your evaluation was from previous year, then this date would not match that evaluation. It would match the most current IEP. During this section, you want to look at the date sent and also the meeting dates, and you would put those into these boxes here. And then at this point, you will be using, again, the most current IEP moving forward within the IR document. When you fill in the date sent, the date the meeting notice was sent, and then again, that meeting date. The other portion of the meeting notice is, let me make sure so you guys can see all that, is that you would you want to document who was invited to the meeting that you listed on that meeting notice. Then you would check to see for the meeting notice, did they actually attend the meeting? So that would be found on the IEP. If all required team members attended and no additional team members attended beyond what was listed, then you would mark yes. For this, you want to remember that your meeting notice should be position related and not specific names. So if you had general education teachers come, you do not want to list the general education teacher's name. You would just put general education teacher. If you had multiple general education teachers attend, then you would still mark yes. Also remember that parents are welcome to invite anyone they would like to the meeting. And did the parents bring someone to the meeting, and is it documented on the attendance or somewhere in the PPWN? If it is documented, then you would mark yes. But if other members attended on behalf of the school, then you won't, and they were not addressed on the meeting notice, you would have to mark no. If you do not have that prior consent for an outside agency to be invited, again, you would mark no. If a IEP team member who was listed on the meeting notice did not attend the meeting, then there's two portions you want to look at. You want to look at one, did the parent and schools consent in writing to this excusal? And two, did the team member excused provide written input into the development of the IEP? If the excusal was done correctly, then you would mark yes. If the excusal was not done prior to the meeting, you would indicate so by marking no.
So Amy,
Yeah.
in this section, you notice there were a lot of if this, then yes, if this, then no. This is a great time in your findings or notes to document which piece you missed. So if you, if the administrator was not at this meeting and you did not get an excusal, you would write findings under the notes. Administrator was not able to attend and no excusal was found. That'd be a great way to use the notes section.
Okay, so then on this section too, if the parent did attend, you would mark yes. If the parent did not, what if the parent did not attend? If you have documentation of multiple attempts to inform the parent of the meeting, then you would mark yes. If the parent did not attend and there is no documentation, then you would mark no. And no is indicating that the district did not give enough time for the parent to attend.
Okay. So once you have your meeting notice completed, then we're going to look at that IEP that you did at that meeting. So remember, you're reviewing the student's most recent IEP for this section. So their current IEP that they're on right now is what we're looking at. So the first area is evaluation reports given to parents. You will need to document somewhere that this was done. You'll need to locate evidence to verify the most recent evaluation documentation reports were given to parents. Keep in mind, this may be documented in the last IEP. If you can find evidence of this, mark yes, that they did receive the evaluation reports. If you cannot find evidence of this, you would mark no. The next area that is a regulation that you need to be looking for is a copy of the IEP given to the parents. So when you're looking at your current IEP, is there evidence somewhere that a copy of that IEP was given to the parents? If there is evidence of this, you'll mark yes. If there's no evidence or initial on the front of the IEP, you would mark no. And then we get back to dates, looking at dates. Was the IEP held within the 365-day time frame? So you're going to fill in your current IEP meeting date and the previous IEP meeting date, and then you're going to compare these two. So if the meeting was held within 1 year of each other, if this was not their first IEP meeting, then you'd mark yes. If the meetings were more than a year apart, you would mark no. They have to be within that year. That's that annual meeting date is a compliance issue. So then we're going to go to that present levels page that we talked about before. So we're looking for that statement. The statement that addresses how the student's disability affects the student's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. So you're going to find that statement and how the disability impacts the progress of the student's involvement. And we're going to make sure that it's individualized for that student and has the student, so make sure it really addresses what is happening to them in the general education curriculum or classroom. So if this statement is present and individualized to that student, you would mark yes. If this statement is missing, you would have to mark no. Then parent participation, very important in this whole process and through IEP, from the referral all the way through. You always have to make sure you're getting parent participation. So on the IEP, we're going to look at those IEP documents and locate evidence of parent input. Usually this shows up in that prior written or in that present level section. You would have parent input. If there is parent input, you would mark yes. If you cannot locate evidence of parent input, you would have to mark no. Then moving on through the present levels, this is when we start looking at that skill-based areas. So we're going to look at all the different skill areas that you have listed on the present levels. And we're going to list those here. So list all the skill areas from the present level page. You're going to verify that each skill area has strengths or needs, and then ensure the skill area is linked back to that evaluation. So we're going to, make sure that this was done during the evaluation, that you brought forward that information, that it's been updated or whatever. Just make sure it is connected to that evaluation that was done. Then once we get all the skill areas listed, we're going to look over at the goals, and we're going to make sure there's goals in all the different skill areas. So if there is a goal for every skill area on the present levels, you're going to look to see, do the goals have the required components? Do they have a condition in which they perform the goal? Is there a clear statement of performance, what the student is expected to do, and how well or how often the student will demonstrate that skill? So once again, we're going to look for all those different components of the goal to make sure they are wrote correctly. If any of the required content for these areas is missing, you would have to mark no. If there's a goal on the IEP that is not related to anything on the present levels, you would have to mark no. If there's an area of need on the present levels that does not have a goal, you'll need to look through all the areas of the IEP to see if that need was addressed elsewhere. For example, maybe it's addressed under special factors, or accommodations. So you got to make sure that every area in the present levels is addressed somewhere in the IEP. If you can locate where the team has addressed the need areas, you will mark yes as compliant. If needs on the present level are not addressed on the IEP, you're going to mark no, as this is a compliance issue. So once we get through that section and we look at all the different skill areas, we make sure that there's goals to match and that the goals have all the different components. You're going to look at how you're going to measure those goals. How is progress going to be measured? So somewhere does it indicate how the progress will be measured? Does it include the method and the frequency of reporting that progress? And do the progress reports align with what is described in the IEP? So if that is all included, then you would mark yes. If not, then you would mark no. And this might be an area where maybe you might put in the notes. Anytime you would have to mark no, you might put in a finding or note to help you go back and determine why that was happened. Now accommodations and modifications. So these are going to list everything that the student will be using. So we're going to go to that IEP. We're going to write all of the accommodations, modifications that the team decided on. And then we're going to determine, does each of these have your frequency, your duration, and your location? If all components are listed for each modification accommodation, you'll mark a yes. If it's not, then it would be a no. Okay. Special factors. So special factors section is all those different little things that every IEP you have to address. So does the student have any special factors that need to be considered? And do the special factors match up to the student's disability and needs? So locate the special factors page in your file and ensure that each special factor is addressed for the student. You must have addressed every special factor in order to mark yes. They all have to be addressed. You can't skip any of them. For a student whose behavior is central to his or her disability, like autism spectrum or emotional disturbance or other health, due to attention or hyperactivity, you should have checked behavior impedes learning, as this is inherent to the disability. And then you're also going to fill out that section on what strategies you're using. So you can reference the IPTA guide for more information about the special factors page. So when you make those accommodations, modifications, you're going to pull forward those accommodations if you're using those for instruction or any state or district assessments. So what type of state or district assessment will the student be taking? You must indicate whether or not students will take state and district assessments with or without accommodations. Assessment accommodations must align with those instructional accommodations that the student is using regularly within their curriculum. These need to make sense for the disability. It has to be individualized and appropriate for that child with the disability. So you will need to indicate alignment as yes or no. All accommodations must be in line in order to select yes for compliance for this section. If the student will not be taking state or district assessments or will be taking them without accommodations, you may mark NA for this section. So, alternate assessment. Is the student taking the alternate assessment? If the student is not taking the alternate assessment, you just mark NA and you move on to the next section. For students taking the alternate assessment, there are special things that need to be addressed in the IEP. They need to make sure that they meet eligibility criteria for the alternate assessment. So the different areas there are making sure the student meets the significant cognitive disability criteria, why they can't participate in the regular classroom, why alternate assessment selected is appropriate. So you have to make sure they meet all that criteria. And do you have documentation through the evaluation and the IEP process to support this type of eligibility for alternate assessment? If there is evidence of all criteria, you would mark yes. If you are missing even one of these criteria, you must mark no, as you are out of compliance. So when you're doing the alternate assessment, make sure this whole section is complete and you have all the documentation needed to show that this child does need to participate in the alternate assessment. So right below there, it's going to ask you if it is documented on the IEP, and you would say yes or no. Transition. Transition, of course, starts at required at age 16. So we're going to be looking at, will the student be turning age 16 or are they older during this IEP? If they are, then you will need to complete this section. If not, you're going to mark NA and move on. Oh, and Amy is supposed to be doing the transition, so I'm going to stop talking, let her go.
Hey, I was just going to let you go with it. You're doing great. So again, like Lori said, that if your student is not transition age, then you would skip this portion. For those that are students that are transition age, we're going to look at all the indicator 13 items. So the first thing is, when does your district begin to address transition? So at a minimum, transition must be addressed by the student's 16th birthday. So you have to ask yourself, will your students be 16 or turning 16 during that IEP? And then if transition is determined on or before age 16, then you will mark yes here. Within that transition, you want to be able to complete a transition assessment for that student. So within this assessment, did you assess the employment, education and training, and independent living portions of that assessment? Is it the first transition IEP? Is it the first transition IEP for the student? If it is not, then you have the assessments been addressed and updated annually? And then are the skills, strengths, and needs from the assessment listed on the class page? Again, just like any area, you have to provide the strength and need for these areas. If all of this occurred, then you would mark yes. Then with that transition assessment, do you have a copy of that assessment report in the student's file? Just like any other evaluation report, you must have that present in the file. Next, we're going to look at the transition report with the skills, strengths, and needs of the area. So did you address the employment, education, training, independent living again? And so this would be with your post-secondary measurable goals. If you addressed all of those and they relate to the student's transition goal, then you would mark yes. So within the post-secondary goal is, again, if this is the student's first transition IEP, if yes, then you would mark an A. If it is not, have the goals been updated from the last IEP? So remember that this can mean that the IEP team got input from the student and they discussed it. If they've been updated, then you would mark yes. Course of study aligning to the transition goals. So the course of study, does that reflect the classes and experience the student will be participating in from now until graduation or exiting special education? So will the classes facilitate the student reaching that post-secondary goal? There should be a correlation between that. And it doesn't matter if the student's going to a four-year college, a two-year college, or workforce. So if yes to both of those, then you would mark yes. If no, then document it in the findings and notes section that it was not completed. So then the transition services and activities. So do you have at least one transition activity in this area for each post-secondary goal? So if yes, you would mark yes. So just make sure that when you're doing this, the IEP team covers all the areas of transition needs in the transition activities. Here's the website here for the TSLP is a great resource to have. I would bookmark that website and use that. Then annual goals related to the student's transition services. So are the student's annual goals related to the transition service needs? Looking at, again, the employment, education, training, and independent living section. Okay, so now we're going to look at, was the student invited to the IEP? This would also be on the meeting notice. There's usually a line that says, you know, was the student invited to the IEP, and then you can insert their name. Okay, so you want to make sure that they, if they are transition age, that they are invited to the meeting and that it is documented on that meeting notice. It is required that they are invited. Some districts also have a separate document for inviting the students, and that's fine if you use that. Just make sure that it's with the meeting notice and that there is documentation that the student was invited. Next, you want to look at, did the student attend the IEP meeting? They should be encouraged to attend the meeting, but they are not required to attend. And then whether the student attended or not, and then student preferences and interests are documented. And so this, at transition age, it's a great way to involve the student in the IEP process. And then they can really have an input into that whole process, and it can be documented on the IEP. So next, we're going to look at consent to invite outside agency. So when looking at this specific area, was the outside agency invited to the IEP meeting? So you want to see if it was on the meeting notice. They should be listed under other on that meeting notice. If they were invited, if so, do you have a form that documents prior to the consent form, the parents or students before inviting the agency? So you would want to invite them before sending out that meeting notice. If not, if you did not invite the agency, and have you addressed why you chose not to invite that agency? This would be a great time or place to address it on the PPWN as well. So the next one are other transition areas. Now the next section is other transition areas that we're going to look at. And so The student turned 17 on, oh, this is a long one, sorry guys. So were the parents or student notified at least 1 year prior to the student turned 18, so on the 17th birthday or before? And did you document the date of the notification? If yes, then mark yes. And what evidence do you have to support this? If this was not done, then you would mark no. Next, we're going to look at a few different sections. So we're going to look at the graduation requirements. The student is projected to graduate and written prior notice.
I think we lost you there, Amy. You want me to continue on?
You could probably go, Lori. I see her phone went out.
Okay. Yep. All right. Amy, while you're getting reconnected there, I'm gonna continue on here. So we're looking at that graduation. If your student's an 11th grader, or will they be graduating next year? So 1 year prior to graduation, parents and guardian students must notify of graduation requirements. If the student will be graduating a full year from this IEP meeting, did you document the specific courses the student must complete in order to meet diploma requirements? If yes, then mark yes. There's more information about graduation in a document called IPTA Guide or Guidance Policy that can help you out with graduation questions. Then as we move down after graduation, if Amy, can you roll that down, Laura? Okay, so you went through all those different sections. The next thing is, did the student graduate? When a student is going to graduate or exit the program, did you issue a prior written notice for that change of placement? So we're looking for that prior written notice that you did a change of placement. And if the student did graduate or age out, did you write a summary of performance? Those are the documents we're looking at for those students who either graduated or aged out. A summary of performance and a prior written notice for a change of placement. The next section is related services. After you get down to transition. And once again, if you need more assistance on transition,
does anybody have questions on transition before we move on?
Okay. And if you're working on transition and you have questions that come up, make sure you can contact your TSLP region rep to get any assistance there, and they'll help you out with anything too. So the next section is that related services. Did you see any other questions on that, Melissa, before I moved on, or?
Nope. You can move on.
Okay, you wrote that. All right. Okay. Related services. Will this student be receiving related services? If there's no related services at all, you can mark NA. If the answer is yes, you do have related services, then you have to look at that frequency, location, and duration and make sure that all of those are listed on for each service that you're doing. And so is there more than one location for related services being provided? If you got some in class or out of school or in a resource room, make sure those are all separated. If there's multiple locations where services are being provided, you must list each location aligned to the service being provided. So once you are done looking at related services in those areas, then we're going to move on to the next section, which is your least restrictive environment. So, and when you're figuring out this LRE, we're going to look at all the special ed services in the skill areas that you are providing services in. So you're going to list those here. You're going to compare your IEP. You're going to write down every skill area that you're providing services on. And does the IEP, okay, does each IEP goal have a service listed? So we're looking at the service area compared to the goals. We want to make sure that you're addressing each goal with a service. So for each service listed, you have to have frequency, location, and duration for that service. So you must have the minutes and how often and that location for each service provided. Once again, if you have different locations, you need to separate those. So please note, this is changing your thoughts regarding duration for the future here as we move forward. So start changing thoughts regarding duration is not the length of the IEP. Duration has historically been included with the frequency statement and now is separate. So your duration is 30 minutes. Your frequency is 3 times a week. So let's just start thinking about that and changing our thought process on that. The duration is not the length of the IEP. So once again, are the same services being provided in multiple locations? If so, then each service location needs to be broken out with a specific amount of time spent in that location. If the student receives specialized instruction in one goal, both within the regular classroom and the special ed classroom, you must eliminate the amount of time spent in each location. We have to know how much they're in the classroom and how much they're out in a resource room or a special education classroom. Make sure you're separating those on your services. After you list all the services and you know you have your frequency, duration, and location for each of those, on your IEP, you're going to look for the next section then, which is participation with non-disabled peers. So have you listed where the student will participate with their non-disabled peer? If it's a preschool student, has the IEP team discussed this component and evidence of the discussion? Then mark yes. So you want to look at all those different areas and where they can participate. This has to be filled out and completed. Then after you get your services done and all those things, we're going to look at that justification for placement. What is their placement? Where is it? As you know, you have a continuum for placement, and you're going to try to determine if the teams discuss this placement for the student. Did you use that accept reject format for each placement option, starting at the top and moving downward till you get to the placement that IEP team decides on? So why were things accepted? Why were different placements accepted or rejected? So within the IEP, the placement of the student must be noted. Make sure this is correct for the student and ensure the justification statement is specific to that student, very individualized, and list reject statements as necessary. There are examples again in the IEP TA guide. Just make sure you go through that continuum of placement and use that accept reject format to determine that. Once you get done with all of that, listing your services and everything is complete, the final thing we're going to look at is ESY, extended school year. So how do we know if ESY was discussed? We're going to look at that section. It has to be documented on the IEP. If the student does not need ESY and this is documented on the IEP, you can mark NA. If the student does not need ESY and this is documented on the IEP, mark, and this is not documented on the IEP, mark no, as this is a compliance issue. It has to be addressed. If ESY is needed, then we're going to make sure the IEP contains information regarding the determination of ESY. What goals are you going to address? The beginning and end dates of ESY. The amount of services that will be given. All that has to be addressed when you're looking at ESY. If any of these elements are missing, you have to mark no, and you're not in compliance. If all these elements are documented, then you can mark yes. If the student's IEP contains a statement that ESY will be determined at a later date, there must be a meeting notice and amendment to that IEP stating when that decision is made and documentation as noted above. If not, if you can't find that in your file anywhere, then you are out of compliance and it would be a no. You have to show where that was discussed and where that decision was made. So if you put in there that you're not going to look at that until April 15th of the, if you did the IEP in September and you're not going to look at it till later, then you need to look to find that prior written notice and what the team decided about ESY, and make sure you address those components about the goal, the dates, and the amount of services to be given. So once you've done all this and you got everything done in your IEP, you've looked for everything and you've searched through your file to make sure all the different things are there, you've noted anything that might be something you need to look at, the final document we're looking at in this IEP is that prior parental written notice after the meeting. So when you find that document, you're going to pull it out and you're going to see if the sent date and the date of the 5 calendar day IEP implementation notice is all together. We want to make sure that those are on there. So in that last section on that prior written notice, parents are given 5 days to consider things that are proposed and refused. Even if the parent waives those 5 days, the team must propose the 5 days for the service start date. So that first blank that's in that section has to be 5 days out from your IEP. You have to at least propose that to the parents that they have that 5 days to consider things. If there are less than 5 proposed days before service start date and the parent did not waive those dates, you're going to have to mark no because this is a compliance issue. If on the prior written notice sent date, the 5 days or more from the proposed service start date and the parent did not waive the 5 days, you will mark yes. If you got that date 5 days out, and even though the parent didn't waive it, you're in compliance because you notified the parent that you were going to start 5 days out. That's the proposed service start date. If the parents waive the 5 days, regardless of the proposed start date, you will mark yes for compliance. There's more information again on the IEP TA guide about documenting date services begin and annual review date, along with the prior written notice examples. So if you have any questions about this section, making sure you got that 5 days out and you've given those parents that option to have those 5 days, please, you can look at that TA guide or ask your regional rep for any assistance with that section. Then you have the A, B, C, and D again on this prior written notice after the meeting. Would you be able to get the gist of what was discussed and decided in regards of the student's IEP by reading the prior written notice? This prior written notice should be individualized for that student that you're reviewing the file for. You should be able to look at this prior written notice and kind of get a good idea of what was going on and why these decisions were made. There has been an explanation of why the district is proposing or refusing an action, and a description of other options considered and why they were rejected. It is required to consider and reject an option. This cannot be left blank, and no options was rejected at this time is not compliant. When you're sitting in an IEP meeting, there is usually always something that is rejected. Sometimes we forget to document it as we're talking, or you need others to help you, but there's always something that you probably considered a parent request or a teacher request or anything that you did reject. So make sure that's documented in there. All right. So, whoops, nope, stay there. Go back. I'm still jabbering away about that section, Amy. So, okay. So the team rejected, example of a team rejected resource room for the area of reading. The IEP team felt the student can be supported with specialized instructions within the general classroom setting. So there's an example of something you rejected, the setting for where you might have services at. In addition, a description of evidence used for this proposed action or refused action, and a description of other factors. So you're going to have these decisions that you made, you rejected or proposed things, and then that next section is going to be a description. That C is the description of the evidence. What did you use to make these decisions in your IEP? If anything is missing from any of these elements, A, B, C, or D, you will mark no as you are out of compliance. If everything is there and it's appropriate for the child, and it's a good, clear understanding, adjust of what was discussed and decided, and then you would mark yes as you'd be in compliance. All right. So once we get through all of that, you have all your documentation, you've gone through your whole file. There's just a few end things that we look to see if it happened or not. It may have and it may not have. Every child could be different. So we look for any amendments to that current IEP that you're looking at. If there's not an amendment to the IEP you are reviewing, you would mark NA and move on. If there was an amendment, say like for ESY or anything changed throughout the school year, you're going to look to ensure that the process was carried out correctly, with or without a meeting, and that a prior written notice was issued with the changes of the IEP noted. So if you're going through your file, make sure you document that all your amendments were done correctly. Then those few little additional items at the end. So additional items you might come across are if a parent declined or withdrew consent for services. If this happens, we're going to look to see when they signed for it and when a prior written notice was given to them. The next is the surrogate. Let's go down to that one there. The parent declined or withdrew consent there. If the student is continuing to be enrolled in school, but parent or student at age of majority determines that they no longer wish to receive services, then does the file contain the parent revoke consent in writing and a prior written notice? So that might be an incident where you might have something like that. If this situation occurs, make sure you use your TA guide to help you to ensure that you're following everything appropriately. The next thing that might occur, rarely, but does once in a while happen, is a surrogate. So if a surrogate is used, you would mark yes, surrogate parent. If not, then it would be NA. So please make sure you're looking at that definition of a parent before determining a student needs a surrogate. And that IEP guide, page 8, will help you with that information. And the last thing we might look at, and if you got this in your file, you would need to review this to make sure you have everything that is needed for transfer students. Transfer students can get a little cumbersome, a little confusing sometimes. So you have to take the time to make sure that you have all the documentation for transfer students. So is this student a transfer student? If not, it's NA, but if they are, then you're going to be looking for different things that the team did when the student came into the district. Is there a meeting notice? And is there a prior written notice documenting decisions of the IEP team? Things that you might document when a child transfers into your district. The district can implement the IEP as written. You're providing comparable services can be implemented. The team determined additional evaluations must be conducted, and eligibility meets South Dakota requirements. All those types of things for transfer students need to be looked at. And there's different things for in-state and out-of-state. So make sure that you're looking at that TA guide to help you with transfer students to make sure you have documented everything necessary and have all the right paperwork for transfer students. If you have everything and it looks good for you, then you can mark yes. But make sure there you can refer to that transfer procedures in the TA guide to help you out with that. They can be a little confusing sometimes. So just make sure you're following that TA guide and documenting that as necessary. Are there any questions up to this point about what we've discussed here on the end here with related services, LRE, anything like that that we can help you with?
So what we kind of went over is if things work smoothly for this student's file. So some questions came, well, what if this situation or what if that situation occurs? What documentation do we need to have? And that's a great opportunity to document under findings and notes. So this situation occurred. I have this documentation. Would that meet the requirements? And so that helps the administrator, or if it's just you and another special ed teacher and an administrator working together to look at files, something to check on. If it's kind of complicated, you can also contact your special education region rep and we can kind of talk about it. Sometimes we talk about dates. And so like one of the dates is, we say the regulation says a minimum of 5 days to give parents time to reflect on what happened at the meeting and what the changes will be. Your district you may think, well, I've always been told I have to give 7 days instead. So you can ask that questions, put that in your notes, as I thought our timeline was 7 days. And so if there are certain things that come up that you aren't sure about, it might be because a district has a different timeline procedure that they would like you to follow. And so you just mark that down, and either the administrator collecting all the data can answer that, or you can find out that information later. So feel free to use that findings and notes section to help you ask questions, follow up, those kinds of things.
Yeah, this is really a document made for you to use in your district to help you get a better understanding of the process and make sure that you're meeting the requirements. So mark those, any questions you have, anything like that, like Melissa said, to really help your district improve and you as a teacher improve.
Great. Can you guys hear me now? Okay, wonderful. So this is a great transition into the last portion of the training. So what we're going to talk about for the last portion is, what do you do with all of those findings and notes that you took in that column? So we're going to talk about a few tabs on the bottom of each of the IR forms. So we worked within file 1. So I will be referencing file 1 when it comes to the next portion. We're going to look at what happens now that you have answered yes, no, NA, and what happened to those notes and how do you use those notes. We're going to really work on the 2 tabs that say caseload data and compiled notes. So with the caseload data, every time that you marked yes, no, or NA, it was calculating a percentage that was given and tallied for the district and individual files. So each of the areas, as you see here, record of access, referral, initial placement, evaluation, eligibility, each of the sections that Lori and I just went over are here in the caseload data. If you marked yes, then that percentage went into an overall percentage of that section. If you marked no, it then was taken off of that overall percentage. So the example here you will see on file 1, record of access. If you had the record of access, then it's 100%. We jump over to evaluation. If there was a no marked within any portion of that evaluation section, then that percentage decreased. You are able to go back and look at what part was marked no and see if, hey, we didn't have it in the file at the time, but I searched through that file again and found it. You can then go back and change it or keep it no. With each individual file review, it also tallies a district average. And so this is a great place for administrators in the state to look and say, hey, a lot of districts are really needing support within this section. It also helps with specific areas to really focus on instead of going over all of the areas. We're then going to look at the compiled notes. This is why it's very important to keep those notes, questions in that column. Again, it breaks it down per section, and it's identical to what was in the IR section. So the areas that you saw on the left-hand side also pull forward to these compiled notes, and it helps match up the ASRDs, and it shows the notes. So you can see in these examples in the first section, it says eligibility for specific learning disability. The note is qualified any certified teacher, ? How many days is considered an adverse effect? These notes are then put underneath that section to where it shows the administrator in the state. This is a specific area of support or an area that we need clarification on for that file. Again, it really helps pull forward the specific questions and specific areas to really help support teachers. Again, within here, it shows you which ASRD is associated with that area. So then you can also go and look at the ASRD to see, is there any guidance given at that point that may help you with the section. So what are some common compliance issues? These are issues that we have found across the state that teachers and schools are having compliance issues with. So that meeting notice, making sure that all required team members are on that meeting notice. And then that consent to invite an outside agency was done prior to the meeting notice being sent. Also, documenting any additional people invited from the district within that notice. A few other areas are parent involvement or input on that PLAPS page. Really making sure that it's documented that the parent had input or concerns were documented on that PLAPS page. Lori went over the specific components of a goal and making sure that all of those components are addressed in each goal of the need area. And then that links to the IEP service time, that there is a service time for each of the areas that are being addressed within the goal area and on the PLAPS page, making sure that link is there. And then PPW and consent and 5-day waiver. Lori went into great detail about that 5-day waiver and the PPW and consent and what is needed for each of those areas. So what if you believe you may have a compliance issue? What if you're going through this and you're reading the notes and you're like, oh man, I don't have this. I think it may be a compliance issue. What should you do? You really want to consult with the team members, your director of special education, and if you still have questions or you need more guidance, contact your regional rep. Each school district has a regional rep, and they are great to call and ask those questions for and really get clarification on. So if you do have a compliance issue, what is the way to fix it? You want to wait until a new IEP or evaluation is done, and then you to correct it at that point. Or you would want to do an amendment to the IEP to address those areas and correct them at that time. Okay, so are there any questions that we can address now? This is the end of the training, and so if you have any questions, specific questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we can help address them at that point. Okay, I don't see any questions coming through. So, Melissa, do you want me to end it or do you want to?
So again, if you have questions on how to utilize the internal review form, especially as an administrator or what the requirements are related to this, please contact Melissa Flora. That would be me. And we can talk through that. If your district has always done this kind of process within your district and now this is a different type of form, you can always contact me and see if what the process you were using before will work in gathering it. So if you don't want to use this form, you have another process in which you gathered all that information. Please feel free to contact me and we can make sure that that still works. So if you have any questions related to this, please let me know.
Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to attend the training. So